All right, welcome to my session today, Extending the Scalability of Orchestrator Using Azure. My name is Steve Tuel. I'm a consultant here at Cireson. I've been in IT for around 20 years now. I've been working in the System Center space really since the 2012 days, so about 10 years. I've been with Cireson for 6+ years and really focused around Service Manager, Orchestrator, Powershell, automation, even things like JavaScript, Angular. The technologies I'm using really depend on the client I'm working with and what we have at our disposal. All right, enough about me. So first off, welcome to Innovate 2021. All of these sessions are pre-recorded and then they will be available after the event. So if you miss one, don't worry, you can get access to it. And then after each one of these sessions, we have a live presenter kind of lounge that you can join to get any questions answered that you may have after you attend this session. So I'll be in the lounge after this session. You can see over there on the left where you need to go in order to get to it, and feel free to join and ask any questions you have. We'll also have just a general open floor. It's a lounge that someone will be in all day. We'll have different people in it throughout the day. You can pop in there at any time and also ask any questions you may have. All right, let's get going. So today's agenda, we're first going to talk about really the 3 automation triggers that you're probably currently using in Orchestrator. Then we're going to talk about the challenges around those. So the common things that you're working through on a day-to-day basis. Then we're going to look at the Azure side of things. So, doing the same type of triggers, but in Azure. So we're going to do a walkthrough and demo of Azure Automation, Power Automate, Azure Functions, and then we'll wrap it up with RPA. And then, of course, lastly, we'll kind of put it all together, get some final thoughts, and then we'll jump into that lounge. All right. So the first trigger, state-based automation. So this is really automation that runs when something occurs. So these are typically your monitor runbooks. So they're always running and they're waiting to see, when a service request was created, when an analyst has a comment, or maybe even it's running and when an incident's been idle for 8 hours, then it triggers. So these are kind of your state-based, always running. Then you've got your scheduled automations. So these are typically your monitor date and time activities within a runbook. So they are waiting to run on that, whatever that particular schedule is. So maybe every hour, every 5 minutes, every morning, weekly. All right. Then we have workflow-based automation. So this is probably the most common trigger and what you're probably using the most in your environment. So this is automation that runs at a certain point in a workflow. So on the service manager side of things, we're defining these workflows. And typically these runbook automations will happen at some point in that process. So maybe there's a review activity once something's been approved, then it triggers a runbook that automates something on the orchestrator side of things. Another example would be something along the lines of, after everything's done on a request, maybe the last activity is an automation that just sends an email to the user. All right, the challenges. So this top bullet is really my biggest challenge. I feel like it's the biggest challenge across the board. So it's all around the troubleshooting and logging of these runbooks. So from a troubleshooting perspective, when you first know that you have an issue with the runbook, you have to check it out, use the runbook tester, and then figure out where your problem is. Well, in production, if a runbook gets called and it's checked out, it'll fail. So yes, there's ways around that. You can copy that runbook and run it somewhere else, but that's a challenge and it's just more work on your end of things, just to troubleshoot it. Another item around troubleshooting is really around the workflow-based automations. So those typically, when they're ready to run on the service manager side of things, they call the runbook an orchestrator and they send the GUID of the activity. So when it comes to troubleshooting that, you use the runbook tester and then you have to provide that GUID. It's not a simple process. It's not something you can just look at and say, oh, yes, it's 1, 2, 3. You have to use PowerShell, or you have to actually look at the activity and copy down that long GUID. It's not, it's not a fun process, and it just takes time. The next thing around troubleshooting is really the nesting of runbooks. So, everyone nests runbooks. I do it. There's nothing wrong with it. But the more nesting you have in your runbooks, the more, when you're troubleshooting, the more runbooks you have to look at. So, yep, is this top level runbook having an issue? Nope. Oh, it calls this other runbook. Let's go look at that runbook. Is that one having an issue? Nope. Oh, but it calls this other one. So you have to go down that rabbit trail, and that just takes time just to figure out where your issue is. From a logging perspective, on the logging side of things, if we're still talking about nesting, as you're going through each of those runbooks, you're looking at the activity log. So you've got 3, 4, 5 different logs that you have to dig through in order to figure out where your issue is. Another thing around logging is just in general, you wind up with logs all over the place. So not only those activity logs, but there's also logging that you can do within any runbook. You can have it right to Event Viewer. You can maybe have it right to a text file. As you start building more and more runbooks, and as more and more people start creating them, you're going to see that you've got log files everywhere. And depending on the runbook you're troubleshooting, it may take time just to figure out, where do I even go to look at the log? All right, next challenge is performance. So inevitably, as you create more and more runbooks, you could run into some performance issues, especially if you're using a lot of monitor runbooks. So monitor runbooks are constantly running. So the more you create, the more of a load you're going to put on that server. So over time, you could see a performance hit. So it's something you always have to be kind of cognizant of. Another performance challenge is what I consider like a perceived performance challenge. So when you are calling a runbook from a workflow-based service request, so when it goes to in progress, it calls the runbook in Orchestrator, it runs, it completes, but on the service manager side of things, sometimes it takes like 5 minutes for it to show that it completed. So that's definitely a perceived performance issue. It's shockingly kind of normal. That's just the way it is. But it's definitely a challenge. So yes, there's ways you can get around it. You can have your runbooks, when they get called, they can complete that activity on the service manager side of things. But having to do that across all your runbooks, that's just, it's a challenge. It's more maintenance, it's more stuff you have to keep up to date. So from a cost perspective, to go along with the performance challenge, you're constantly, as more and more runbooks are being added, you're constantly worried about, do we need another runbook server? Do we need more resources on a server? There's a cost associated with that. There's also SQL licensing. There's server licensing. Another challenge around cost is going to be just the administration of Orchestrator. So someone has to spend time maintaining it, maintaining the servers, troubleshooting things. That's definitely a challenge around cost. So the last challenge is going to be access to Azure resources. So as yes, you can connect to Azure resources from your Orchestrator environment. I do it all the time. I have customers who do it all the time. The challenge really is around, you're having to store credentials, connection strings, maybe certificates, and these sometimes are stored in the .NET activity itself within a runbook. Maybe they're stored in a variable. Maybe it's some file somewhere that you're reading from. as you have more and more people create these runbooks, what you're going to notice is that the storing of all that information is spread out across a bunch of different places. So when it comes to updating those or changing them, it's quite the ask just to figure out where all are we even using it. One last thing around access to resources, you could have potentially a challenge around just connecting up to an Azure service. So that would be a challenge as well. All right, let's talk Azure Automation. So when it comes to Azure Automation, at the highest level, you're creating what's called an Azure Automation account. And you typically are starting with just one when you're first fiddling with it. Then, if the scenario where you would need more than one would be if you're doing it across different environments. So you have a prod one, you have a dev one, you have a staging one. Another scenario for multiple accounts would be if you have different resource groups that need to stay separate. So you would have an Azure Automation account in one and then a different one in another. Inevitably, what you need is for these they have runbooks, and you need these runbooks to actually run on-prem. So Service Manager, right? If you're using Service Manager, you need that on-prem connectivity. So what you can do in your on-prem environment is create what's called a hybrid runbook worker. So these are any server you have in your environment. You can run a script. It basically connects up to that automation account and stores that information, and then it's constantly going outward to Azure and seeing if anything got triggered, if anything needs to run on them. So those are the hybrid workers. Next up are the runbooks themselves. So these run PowerShell. You have the ability to call any PowerShell module you want within here. So at the automation account level, you can add modules that you get some out of the box. And then there's also, if you have any custom ones or really any from anywhere, you can import those into your Azure Automation account. The last item is really around any of these runbooks, you can add a webhook to them so that they can be triggered via an HTTP post. And you'll see that here in my demo here in a minute. All right, demo time. This is the fun time, right? So I'm going to show you a workflow-based automation. So something that happens in a request, when it's triggered, it calls a webhook that's tied to an Azure Automation runbook. And for the next few demos, I'm going to kind of have a common theme here. So this scenario is really around, maybe you have, in this case, it's an HR team that, everyone's working out of teams now, and they don't want to have to do any of the work that, they have a part in the process as it relates to a few service requests in your environment, but they want to manage all that through planner tasks. And you can add planner tasks in Teams. So they want to just live in that world. When it's time for them to do something, they get that task and then they complete it. This would also be a scenario where maybe you don't want them to have analyst access in the portal. So in this case, they don't even have any access on the portal side of things, and we're going to let them do all the work through a planner task. So for this automation, what we're going to do is when an activity goes to in progress and it's assigned to the HR team, we're going to have it create that task on the planner side of things. Let's check it out. All right. 1 minute. First, we're just going to look at these automation accounts. So I'm going to log into Azure. So here are our automation accounts. I've got my one here. So at the automation account level, first thing to look at would be modules. So here's all the modules you get out of the box. You get quite a few, as I mentioned, and then I actually have this custom one, this planner module that I use, that I'm going to use to create these planner tasks. So I just, got it off the internet and then added it via the interface here. Next thing, so here's your credentials. So as it relates to the, any runbook tied to this automation account can use these credentials. This is where I'm storing my credentials, connections, certificates. The next item would be hybrid worker groups. So here's my hybrid worker group. I have one server in it. This is my my on-prem server here that's acting as that hybrid worker. All right, let's look at jobs real quick. Here's all the different jobs. So this is where you could go to see each time a runbook ran, you'll get kind of the logging right here. We'll look at logging and talk about it a little more in depth in a little bit. So here are the runbooks. And the one I'm actually going to show is this SCSM create team task. So when I go into it, you can see here, these are all the times it's ran. So you get more logging just as it relates to the specific runbook. You've got things like schedules. If this needed to follow a schedule, if I wanted this runbook to run every hour, I would do that here. In this case, we're actually using a webhook to trigger it. So this is where I created the webhook. Very simple process. You just add it, you give it a name, and then it spits out a URL that you can use to post to. Let's look at, excuse me, the actual runbook. So this runbook, since it's triggered, when it's triggered via that webhook, it takes in this webhook data. So from the service manager side of things, when I call it, I send it the activity information, that manual activity information that we need in order to create the task. So I'm not going to get too in depth here with the actual script, but it takes in the information that was sent to it. It figures out the group name and plan name. So that's the task side of things. And then it actually creates the task. So it connects in to my instance of planner. Here it's using that automation variable. So the variables I just showed you where I stored my credential. Then it's actually connecting. Here it just figures out the groups and plans, and then inevitably it gets to the bucket. So this is where it's actually going to drop that task. So down here, this is where it actually gets created, add a description, and then here we actually, one thing from a team's perspective as it relates to tasks is when you are assigned a task, you will get notified in Teams. But there's not this thing where it's not going to do it if you're associated with the group and just anything lands in there. So what this does is it just posts the message to that team in their channel saying, hey, you have a new task. So that's what this part does right here. So let's look at this in Service Manager, actually initiate it. Give it a minute to wake up. There we go. All right, so here is my request time off. So this, what I'm going to do is just enter a date here. Save. So what you'll see here on this request is that it's got two activities. This is a PowerShell activity. So this is the actual activity that calls the webhook. I'll show you that here in a second. And then this is the activity for the HR team. So let's look at this activity here, the PowerShell behind it. So I'm going to actually pull it up in the console. I can see it actually already finished. Let's take a look at the PowerShell. So when this gets called, it is, all it's doing is you drop it in front of a manual activity and it looks at that next manual activity, figures out all the information about it. So title, ID, description, support group, and then here's where it actually calls that webhook. So it triggers that Runbook in Azure and sends that webhook data. So here's the webhook data. And then obviously here, this is where it actually invokes it. So let's have a look. Refresh this. This is probably now in progress. And I'm going to look in Azure real quick. Not there, but over here. Create team task, jobs. I'm going to refresh. So you can see right here, this already ran. But let's see it in Teams, right? That's the part you want to see. So over here, you can see I'm logged in as Tracy Brown, and she's a member of this group and this channel. So we got a post here that says more work. Here's the MA, time off request for me. If I look at it from a task perspective, go here and up here. I like the list view. So here it is right here. You can see that it took that MAID, it concatenates who the affected user is in the description, and it creates the task. So I'm just going to assign it to myself real quick. We'll use that in the next demo. All right, pretty cool stuff. Let's jump back into the deck. Give me 1 minute. So there's your workflow-based automation calling an Azure Automation Runbook via a webhook. All right, the next thing to talk through, Power Automate. So this is another service in Azure. At its highest level for Power Automate, when you're creating what they call flows, you're defining the flow type. So this is the kind of how it gets triggered. So is it automated? Is it instant, kind of a manual thing, or is it a scheduled automation? The next big item around these flows are your connectors. So this is really where, when you're creating your flow, you're basically subscribing to another service somewhere. So these connectors, you get a ton of them out of the box. Connectors out to Teams, Office 365, Microsoft Forms. There's all kinds of stuff out there. You'll see here in a minute. You also have the ability to create custom connectors. So if there's anything out there that you don't have a connector for and you want to add it, you can, maybe it's a custom web API. You can add that as there's a process to create that as a connector and then use it within your flows. When you're creating these flows, you're basically defining these actions and conditions. So actions are really, okay, I'm subscribed to Teams. So I'm saying when something is posted in Teams, send me an email. Or maybe when someone tweets to our company, let's post something in Teams. These are all actions. And then you can also define conditions. So that's just kind of the if-else side of things. The last item here is Cloudflow activity. So this is what they call this is the monitoring, the logging of these flows. So we'll check that out here in a second. All right, another demo. So in this one, we're talking about a state-based automation, and we're going to use Power Automate. We're going to see a flow that is subscribed to Planner, so to those tasks. And every time a task is completed in Planner, I want to complete the associated activity in Service Manager. Let's check it out. All right. Going to come here, open up Power Automate. So when you first log into Power Automate, you can see here, there's a bunch of these templates. So these are predefined flows for all kinds of scenarios. As you can see here, when I click on that, there are a ton of things that people have already thought of and already done, and they're available. You can easily kind of move these into your implementation and use them right away. So there's a ton of stuff here. You can also see kind of what they are. So is it automated? Is it scheduled? You know, how many downloads are there? Is it, you know, is it a very popular one? If it is, then it's probably something that you may want to use. Here's the connectors. So as you can see here, there are a ton of connectors to all sorts of things. It doesn't even have to be an Azure service. So there's a lot already out there. And then once again, if you wanted to add a custom one, you would do that within here as well. So my flows, this is really where you can see your defined flows. So when you're first creating them, just to show you real quick, you have basically, this is the flow types. So is it scheduled? Is it going to be an instant one, or is it an automated one? So you would select that, and then it's going to, you know, basically take you into something that looks like this. So what I'm going to do real quick to kind of time this right is I'm going to, so Tracy assigned this, you know, this activity is basically saying, hey, Steve requested time off, go into the HR system, update time off for this user. So Tracy did that, and she completes it. So here's your state-based automation. When something happens, trigger. So under my flows, I've got this one that says when a task is completed. You get kind of a home page here that shows you run history, the different connections you're making. More importantly, it's got the actual items that it's going to run through. So the first item, this is where I subscribe to Planner, and I'm saying, hey, when a task is completed. So when you add this, you're basically adding steps here. When you add it, you put in your group ID and then the plan ID. So right, this is what I want you to watch for, and anytime anything's completed within here, trigger this. So just to show you what that looks like, you have a blank slate when you first open this, and like here for, I can search for maybe Planner. These are all the different actions that I can look for as it relates to Planner. So there's a bunch of stuff here. In this case, we're saying when something's completed. So when it completes, I'm basically using a variable to concatenate, or not concatenate, to strip out the manual activity ID, because if you remember on the title of that task, it had the ID plus the description plus who the affected user was. So when it completes, I need to figure out what that ID is so I can complete it on the Service Manager side of things. So that's what I do here. I set the variable, and then within this, I look at the assignments. So who's it assigned to? I get that user. I'm actually sending myself an email here, which isn't really necessary, isn't for this demo, but just to show you, it's a way to send it to myself and just kind of see the data that's coming across. The big part of this is really here's the actual where it gets completed on the service manager side of things. So what I've done is I've actually used, we have a new feature in the portal, newish feature called add-ins. And through add-ins, you can actually create your own APIs, and then you can call them, so in my case, externally, and I have this custom one to complete a manual activity. This is a whole demo on its own. Sherry is actually doing a session on that. So if you are interested, I highly suggest you attend that. What I'm doing with this is really just, I call the API, so I'm doing an HTTP post, and I'm sending in that MAID, who the user was, who was assigned, and then optionally putting a comment. I'm not doing that here. So let's look, I'm gonna go back one. So here's run history. So you can see here, this one just ran. If I click on it, you can see you get your, obviously green check marks are a good thing. If you had any issues, you would see some red X's here. So yes, it looks like it ran. So let's see on the service manager side of things, did it really run? I can already tell this is completed, so that's a good sign. Activities, here's that manual activity. So since it knows that Tracy completed the task, it added her as the activity implementer. I have it setting an actual end date, and then obviously it completes it. So pretty cool thing there, you know, to see how Power Automate, you can use that as a state-based automation and connect to a ton of different services in Azure and take actions either within Azure or, you know, on-prem, as you kind of saw here. All right, let's go back to the deck. All right, so there's our state-based automation using Power Automate. Next up, Azure Functions. Excuse me. So Azure Functions are a lot. I use them a lot, and really what I'm going to do, when I'm going to show you in the demo, I use them. You can use PowerShell. So it's kind of like Azure Automation, but you have a few more options as it relates to these functions. And one quick note, you don't have to use PowerShell. There's other languages you can use, and I'll show you that in a little bit. So these function apps, when you create them, you have the ability, you can add more security around the initiation of them. So the webhooks in Azure Automation, that's just an HTTP post out there. There's really no security around it. The function apps allow a lot more as it relates to TLS, SSL. Do you want authentication before it can be triggered? There's a bunch of stuff in there that I'll show. When you create a function app, you're creating templates, and these templates are really your triggers. So is it an HTTP trigger? Is it a timer trigger? Is it something that triggers out of Azure services? You're also able to use these managed identities. So this you can also do in Azure Automation. I'm going to show you in the demo for an Azure function where it uses a managed identity. But this is a way to store all of your secrets, keys, certificates in Azure Key Vault. So you can give your function app, you can set up a managed identity that has access, permissions to read your secrets or keys or certificates. Last item to talk about is these advanced tools, or what they call Kudu. The only thing to really talk about here is this is what's used to, if you're using PowerShell, this is where you upload your PowerShell modules. All right, another demo. So in this one, we're going to do a scheduled automation, and it's going to be one that basically it's an Azure function that runs on a schedule. So what we're going to do here is, maybe the manager of the HR team wants a weekly message in Teams that summarize all the open tasks. All right, 1 minute. So here is a function app. You can see here I have one already created. Just to show you real quick, when you're adding these, when you're first creating them, right here is where you're defining really what language you're going to use. So in my case, I'm using PowerShell, but here, here's your other options. I'm going to go actually into this function app. Excuse me. So the first thing I wanted to show you was all the stuff around security. So here's authentication. This is where you can add, hey, this can't get triggered unless someone has authenticated, using a variety of providers that you can add. There's also, here's the TLS SSL settings. You can wrap, they have to use particular protocols when they're calling your function. So you didn't really see this with Azure Automation with that webhook, but you can certainly add it here. And you could wrap your Azure Automation runbooks in Azure Functions so that when they're called, if there's more security that needs to happen, you do have that ability to kind of wrap those. Here's the managed identity. So by default, this is off. All I did was turned it on. And then what you can do is you give it role assignments. So I gave it reader access to this particular key vault that has a secret here. So it's the password I'm using to authenticate to Planner. The next item here would be, real quick, let's show. So advanced tools. This is that Kudu. Give it a minute to authenticate. There's some stuff in here. The only thing I want to show you is where I would go to add the module. So under this debug console, you'll see the directory here under site, www root. You create this modules folder here, and then you drop your PowerShell modules within it. So any module that you want to reference in this function app, you would, all you got to do is just copy, you can install the module locally, and then you can do a drag and drop and it'll copy it right up here. And then you can reference it in the actual PowerShell within the function app. All right, close that. So let's look at the actual functions. So, by default, there is nothing here. When you go to add a function, here's where you're defining your template. So how does it trigger? So here's all your options there. In this case, I chose a timer trigger. So within that, a couple of things. First off, this integration piece. Since it's a timer trigger, we have to define when does it run. So right here, it creates this for you by default. And when you click on this is where you define the schedule for the timer. So you use these cron expressions to define when it runs. So this is basically saying run at 4 p.m. every Friday. Excuse me. So let's look at the actual PowerShell that gets run. So when this runs on that time, it will, I'm just logging out a couple of basic things there, but it will import the key vault module. So I'm using a PowerShell command to get since I have that read access via that managed identity, to get the password that I need in order to authenticate to Planner in my instance. So for this one, I'm actually not using that Planner module. I just wanted to show other ways that you can interact with it. So you can use the Graph API to interact with Planner with these tasks and do certain things. So first, in order to do that, you need to have an authentication token. So first I authenticate using that stored vault username and password. Once I get the authentication, I then call Graph. So I call Planner, and then I know the actual bucket. You could kind of loop through these in order to figure out which one it is you need. I just kind of cheated and got the direct ID. But what I do is I call this API, I send in my authentication token, and it basically sends back all of the tasks within that team or within that plan. The tasks that it returns everything. So it's active stuff and completed stuff. I don't want completed stuff, right? The requirement is we just want to see everything that's active. So that's what this does. It filters those out. Once it gets the tasks, it then calls that same webhook that I have set up in Teams, and it will post those tasks within that channel. So that's what it does right here. So what you can do with these is, as you're building them, you actually have the ability to test and run them directly in the window here. Well, I am going to run this. And I'm kind of using these write output to kind of, as I get to certain points in the code, I just want to see that it got past certain things. So here in a minute, you'll see it spit out a few things. So there it ran. We got our key vault secret. We successfully connected. Here's the result of that API call. It sent me back all of the tasks, the open ones, and then we posted it in Teams. So let's see if it did that. So back here in general, if I go to posts, there it is. So this is really that example of a scheduled-based automation. And what we're doing, we're using an Azure function in this scenario. One thing that I want to point out real quick is the logging. So across these various things happening in Azure, there is logging that you can look at. So here is my login analytics workspace. And if I go under logs here, go here, save. So Azure Automation logs. When I run this command here, this is going to show me all the stuff that's happened, within the last 24 hours. So all of that, the write output and everything that's happened around a runbook that's run as it relates to Azure Automation is right here. So you can subscribe to these. If you see an error somewhere, send me an email so I know I need to check it out. Azure Functions, so they are also in here. Here's all the output from when it ran. Another scenario where you could subscribe to something and notify yourself if you're having issues. So the Power Automate side of things, you can, I'm not doing it currently, but you can also push those logs within here as well. So now you've got that one-stop shop where you can see what's going on across all your runbooks. All right, let's go back to the deck. All right, the next item. So robotic process automation, or RPA. Just sounds fun saying that. You think you're smart just because you said it. Very cool stuff. What this is kind of, it's a lot like Flow. So you're defining certain steps you want to happen, and this would be locally within like your workstation or within a server. And what you're using is something called, you install something called Power Automate Desktop. And that's the application that's running locally on your machine, and you can have it do all kinds of crazy cool things. The other thing you have to install is this on-premise data gateway. So that is really the connection. That's what connects the Azure side of things to this Power Automate Desktop locally. So you can trigger things can happen in Azure. They can trigger a flow that then calls your kind of local flow that you've created in Power Automate Desktop. There's this notion of attended versus unattended. So attended means that there's got to be an active session. So wherever you have Power Automate Desktop installed, there needs to be an active session. Then there's unattended. So you don't need that active session. Unattended is the way more expensive one. So I'm using the attended one for this demo, but they're both, it's just a matter of whether or not there's a session logged in. All right, one more demo. Let's check it out. So I'm kind of moving away from all the planner stuff. So in this demo, we have this scenario where, all of the employees, they keep track of their expenses in a spreadsheet. It's, some spreadsheet out on a shared drive somewhere. They just add expenses, and then weekly, you as the admin, you have to open up this older billing app and manually enter those expenses. So a very robotic thing that you should be able to automate, right? So, the big thing, the big point to get across here is that this billing app does not have an API. There's no way for us to call it and automate things. So in comes Power Automate Desktop. All right. Real quick, what I wanted to show first is just the Azure side of things. I'm sorry, within Flow, under my flows, these two down here, these are actually ones that I created on Power Automate Desktop, and then they're automatically up here in Power Automate. So you can trigger these from up here in Azure, and they trigger something down in your local environment. So there's just a few here. I just wanted to show you what that looked like. So when it comes to the installation on either on a server or your local machine, here's the data gateway. So not a lot to see here. You have to install it. You sign in. This is really what authenticates you to Power Automate, and it keeps the two in sync. The big thing here is this Power Automate Desktop. So that's what this is down here. First, what I'm going to show you is kind of the process when you're creating a new flow. So we're going to call this my demo. And when you first create these, the first thing you have here are really you can define inputs. So if you need it to be sent something, in order for it to run, it needs to know, whatever it is you're automating. This is where you would add an input. You've then got your actions over here. So there are a ton of actions. These, you're dragging and dropping them over here to kind of create that same type of flow that you saw in Power Automate. Some ones just to show you, this one we actually use here in a second. I want you to launch Excel. I want you to read it or write to it. I want you to do something in Exchange, retrieve email messages. process email messages, send email. There's a ton of stuff here. Active Directory, right? We want to automate creating a user. There's a bunch of things. Once you drag these over, depending on what it is, it's going to get, that specific information that it needs in order to know what to do and what to connect to within your flow. One other thing here is, so these recorders, you have the ability to, it will monitor clicks or what you're typing or entering within either just on your desktop or on a website. So we'll look at desktop recorder here. I can click on this, and all you got to do is click record, and you'll see here it's going to start. So there it sees I click the start button, and maybe I want to open up Reader. So that's it. I mean, you can see here it captured that. When you're done, you just click finish, and it'll take you into that flow. And then every time you run this, it's going to do that same thing. So let's actually see that in that billing app example. So just to show you, here is on the desktop. Here's my expenses spreadsheet. This is where everyone goes to enter stuff. You can see here we've got this information. We need to enter it into this billing app. So there's the spreadsheet. Here is the billing app. And to enter a new expense, you just click this, you select the client, then you enter in some information and save it. So I've created a flow here. Close that. Terribly named. That will automate all that for us. So as you can see here, once this opens up, we're going to close this. So here it's launching, you tell it where to look for the spreadsheet, it's getting all the rows, it's reading it, it's then pressing the start button, it's basically launching that billing app. And then for each basically row in that spreadsheet, it's going to follow these steps. So it's going to open it and it's going to enter the information, click save, and then just keep going. So let's see it. I'm going to turn on my camera so you know I'm not cheating. I'm not clicking anything here. And you can see over there on the left, it's opening, it opened the app. Now for each row, it's going to enter that client information, select them. We're also doing the description and then the amount. So I'm not doing anything here. And you can see on the left, it's just it's cycling through. So now it's on the next row. Enter this information. If you have errors with this, you would see, it would fail out, and then you would see some logs at the bottom that tell you exactly which step, which click it didn't pick up. We got one more to go here. $250, and there's no more data in the spreadsheet. And there you go. It's entered the information for you. You don't have to do anything. So very, very cool stuff there. The options are endless, especially every organization has that application that is really old. There's no APIs for it. There's no way to automate some of the very manual things that those admins are doing. Also, think about the website side of things. So if there's something that if there's a process around entering data on a website, you can use this web recorder here to go through the process. It'll record it, and then you can automate the information that you send into it. All right, let's wrap this up. All right, so that was a desktop automation using RPA. All right, so closing thoughts. Logging and troubleshooting. So on the Azure side of things, you can see here, all of this stuff can all go into Azure Monitor. So you can be, when it comes to troubleshooting and just logging, there's not a question of where do I need to go? Where's the log for this thing versus where's the log for this thing? From a troubleshooting perspective, all that information is there. You can get to fixing the issue quicker. Since you're using Azure Monitor, you can have it send you an email whenever it picks up some kind of an error. There's a lot of things you can do around that to be more proactive. Nick is actually doing a session on that. He's taking certain actions based on when we find an error in Azure Monitor. So I would highly suggest going to that session. From a performance perspective, so now we're no longer worried about server resources. You know, how many runbooks are running? Do we need another Orchestrator server? You don't have to worry about anything around performance because Azure is handling that underlying infrastructure for you, and you're not paying for it. You're just paying for the runbook itself that is running. Cost. So, you know, there's not a good like apples to apples way to say this is the exact cost versus this is the exact cost. You know, the cost discussion is really around, you know, if you're not having to support that underlying infrastructure. So there's cost around the updating of those servers, the maintaining of those servers, the maintaining of the Orchestrator environment. You don't have to worry about any of that anymore. You know, Azure is going to take care of it for you. Lastly, access to Azure resources. So big item is you're no longer storing your credentials all over the place, connections, certificates all over the place in Orchestrator. You've got a central location depending on what you're using on where you can put all of that information. That is it. So questions, I'm going to hop over into that virtual lounge. Thanks for joining me today. And if you have any questions, please join me. Thank you.